August 3rd, 2021 might have been the worst day for Hearthstone. But why? See, every couple of months, Hearthstone releases a brand new expansion, which is basically a collection of new cards to make the game feel fun and fresh. And most of the time, an expansion does exactly that. It introduces a brand new mechanic or a brand new aesthetic into the world of Hearthstone that is really enjoyable to play with. But just like every other card game, Hearthstone eventually released an expansion that, well, almost killed the game. And I know what you're thinking. How could you kill something that's already dead? Very original. Now, since Hearthstone has now been out for almost 10 years, you would think that the designers of this game would have ample time to reflect on old expansions, figure out what worked and what didn't work, and only build upon that. Well, it's safe to say that they didn't learn a single thing. The expansion that I am referring to that almost killed Hearthstone is known as United and Stormwind. In my opinion, the best thing about Hearthstone is board tension. Because of how you interact with your opponent in Hearthstone, you can't really do anything on your opponent's turn. So having a board means that my decisions will impact the game and my opponent has to respond to that. And I've always felt like when Hearthstone's at its best is because the board tension matters so much and it often can decide the outcome of a game. And I think overall in classic Hearthstone, the board mattered an absolute ton. Of course, there was a couple of things that, didn't feel great. If you played with Force of Nature Savagery, you probably understand what I'm talking about. Now, Hearthstone, unfortunately, just like every other card game, eventually falls victim to power creep. Power creep is obviously the idea that cards get stronger as new expansion comes out because they have to sell new and exciting cards. But honestly, Hearthstone did a pretty good job with a lot of their expansions. There's a couple of outliers like Undertaker and Curse of Naxxramas or Dr. Boom and GVG. We also got a 4-mana 7/7 in Old Gods. That was absolutely crazy. Even though the power level was going up, I felt like Hearthstone continued to do a great job of making sure the board mattered. But other than power creep, the other really important thing about Hearthstone is the design of cards. Like I mentioned, because I can't interact on my opponent's turn, card design is very important in a game like this. And often, even though a card isn't necessarily the most powerful thing in the world, the worst thing about it can be how it plays in Hearthstone. Which brings me to Un'Goro. Un'Goro introduced one of the coolest mechanics ever added to Hearthstone, which is the quests. These were legendary spells that started in your hand that would allow you to play for a very powerful effect as the game went on. The trade-off of this was that you lost one card in your mulligan and you had to play the quest basically on turn one. Otherwise, what are you running this quest for? The thing is, not all of these quests were equal. See, I think Blizzard absolutely tried their best to make sure that the quests all felt unique and fun for their individual classes, but unfortunately, one of these classes got a quest that was extremely unfun to play against, and that one is obviously the Caverns Below. See, this is the only quest out of all of the Un'Goro ones that drastically changed the game the second the quest was finished. It had an ongoing effect that made all of your minions 5/5s for the rest of the game. And this enabled polarization that we have never really seen before in Hearthstone. See, the issue was if you were playing like any slower deck, you already lost the game before the mulligan was even finished. You had no pressure to stop the rogue from completing their quest. So unless the rogue just had the worst draw of all time, you were dead. It was not great. So the meta had to respond to the rogue quest by playing more aggressive, which meant that the game was faster paced. And a lot of these really cool mechanics that they introduced didn't really get their time to shine because the rogue quest was just there waiting to strike. So in other words, if you couldn't kill your rogue opponent by turn 5, the game was already over, which, saying that sentence out loud is hilarious to me because in modern Hearthstone, you're probably dying on turn 5 anyways. Arguably the most important factor with the rogue quest was that it was a guaranteed win condition that started in your hand. One of the best parts about Hearthstone and card games in general is the variance of your deck. Sure, you can make it as consistent as you want to, but often your draws will make a difference in how the game plays out, and that's what makes card games interesting every single time you play a match. With the rogue quest, you get your win condition, and then all of a sudden every single one of your minions are just really good. The variance isn't there nearly as often, which means you're basically dying the same way every single time. It is important to note that Warlock also had an ongoing quest just like rogue, but the Warlock quest was infinitely worse, and I think that had to do with completing the quest. Discarding your cards meant that you didn't have resources to discard more cards, and by the time you finally got your portal finished, you're summoning 3/2s every single turn. If the game went on for an eternity, 3/2s every single turn could be the difference of you winning or losing the game. But unfortunately, games don't go on for eternity. At some point, someone will lose, And those 3-2s never really got the chance to shine. I know there's going to be some person who are going to be like, actually in my bronze 3 game, this quest was absolutely phenomenal. Eventually they ended up nerfing the quest, which was very important to the metagame of Journey to Un'Goro, and it made it one of my favorite expansions of all time. They decided to make it so that you have to play a minion with the same name 5 times, which actually drastically slowed the quest down, but overall was still playable in the metagame, and every single time you went against it, it just wasn't a super fun time. So what can we learn from all of this? One, having a very strong win condition that starts in your hand every single game is probably not great if that win condition can be completed very consistently and is very powerful. Also, cards that cause insane polarization that stop strategies from existing is probably not something you want in a card game where you can't interact with your opponent. And number 3, quests honestly were a really great mechanic. Don't let the rogue quest fool you in thinking that this mechanic sucked, because there are countless other examples that made the game extremely fun. Which brings me to Savers of Uldum. Full transparency, this is one of my favorite expansions of all time. And you probably guessed it, they brought back quests again, but this time with a very interesting twist. See, with Uldum, when your quest was completed, it replaced your hero power. Now they did do that in Journey to Un'Goro with the warrior one, but just let Savers of Uldum have this. The reason why I think quests were so successful in Savers of Uldum is even though they all had ongoing effects, you still have to spend 2 mana every single time to get that effect. This was a great balancing act with the warrior one in Un'Goro. Having a Ragnaros hero power is extremely good, but it is completely balanced by the fact that A, it takes a long time to get to, but mainly you can only do it once per turn and you have to spend an additional 2 mana, which made almost every single quest in Un'Goro feel very healthy for the game and very fun to play with and against. Almost every single one. See, the problem is Druid still exists. That's the end of that sentence. The Druid quest had a passive hero power, which meant you're not spending 2 mana every single time. And that effect was extremely powerful. It turns out getting both choose one options from every single card onwards from the quest is an insane amount of tempo, but also an insane amount of value. And even though the polarization wasn't as egregious as it was with the Rogue quest, you did still feel like you were completely locked out of the game with some matchups. I will say, and this is just my opinion, that completing the Druid quest was a lot more interesting than completing the Rogue one, because at least there was like a decision of, do I spend all my mana to keep up with tempo, or do I fall a little bit behind so I could have a huge power spike later? And even though the Druid quest wasn't nearly as egregious as the Rogue one, it was another example of the same play patterns that we saw with Un'Goro. But it did feel like the design team at Hearthstone did learn from what made Caverns Below so unfun to play against, and the Druid one, even though it wasn't the greatest thing to be playing against at the time, didn't ruin the metagame whatsoever. As you could probably guess with the theme of this video, that wasn't the last time that we saw quests. And in fact, in United and Stormwind, we didn't just get quests, we got something way worse. Quest lines. Now, I know you're really excited to get to United and Stormwind. Believe me, I am so excited to talk about that expansion, but we have to go through one more thing before we get there, and that is the release of Demon Hunter. Now, for those of you who were not playing when Demon Hunter was released, the power level went from about here to about here. Unlike any other expansion that we have seen thus far, Demon Hunter's release expedited the power creep of this game to levels that we have not really seen before. Demon Hunter's core identity is mana cheating, draw, and damage, which is why the game probably got so much more powerful. Every other class kind of had to boost up their strength to match Demon Hunter. Because Demon Hunter was so strong, they had to nerf like 5 cards in 24 hours, which Hearthstone has never gotten close to ever before. United and Stormwind decided to bring quests back for the 3rd time. This was under the new idea of quest lines, and unlike older quests, had multiple steps in order for you to get your final reward. So imagine an expansion where almost every class got its own version of the Caverns Below, had a very consistent way of completing it, but most importantly took away what I believe most people find the most fun in Hearthstone: board tension. See, the one thing about the Caverns Below was once the quest was completed, the board still kind of mattered. Yeah, you're probably gonna lose because you're just gonna get outvalued and out-tempoed, but at least the 5/5s on board were relevant opponents, and in the odd time you would die to a charge minion because, you know, Stone Tusk Boar existed at that time. But the weird thing about United and Stormwind's quest lines is you didn't even need the board. You just needed to be able to play the minion that you got at the end of it, and the rest of the game was just from your hand. So taking away the board from Hearthstone is definitely a choice that was made, and that was the biggest consequence of the quest lines introduced, and definitely the reason why most people hated United in Stormwind. Without a board in Hearthstone, both players are just playing a single player game. There's actually no reason for you to even think you're playing a multiplayer game, because if I'm just racing towards my quest line being completed before my opponent, it doesn't really feel like a sense of back and forth. It's just, I'm gonna beat you, haha, you're an idiot. Not every quest line did this. There are a couple of honest ones that they did release, but the wide majority of them were just playing a single player game that made Hearthstone the least fun that at least I have ever played it. And I believe the best example to show you how miserable this expansion was the Mage quest line. Sorcerer's Gambit, like every other quest, would start in your opening hand. Your objective to get to the next step in the quest line was to cast a Fire, Arcane, and Frost spell. And your reward, as you could probably imagine to be more consistent, was to draw a spell. The next part of the quest line is Stall for Time, which again, you have to cast a Fire, Arcane, and Frost spell, but this time you discover a spell outside of your deck. This is actually really important for the next step because, you know, you got to cast a Frost, Fire, and Arcane spell again, but discovering a card outside your deck could give you a spell school that you did not have yet in your hand to complete it. After finishing the final step in the quest line, your reward is Arcanist Dawngrasp, which is a 5-mana 7/7 with the insane battle cry. For the rest of the game, you have spell power plus 3. Malygos used to be a 9-mana 4/12 with spell power plus 5. And the only time Malygos was truly used is with a bunch of mana cheating. So imagine a world where, yeah, you don't get as much spell power, but you don't even need it on board anymore. And for the rest of the game, you have that additional effect. As you could probably imagine, the turn after that Arcanist Dawngrasp was played, the game was virtually over. But most importantly, the board no longer was relevant. If you played any slower deck that was based on removal and playing for the late game, you lost that game. There is literally nothing you could do to stop the mage from killing you from hand. And the weird thing is about Sorcerer's Gambit is it wasn't even considered one of the best quest lines. In fact, if you look at meta reports throughout United and Stormwind, Mage wasn't really considered a tier 1 deck because the other quest lines were better than this. I just showed you one of the most polarizing cards of all time, and it's not even close to one of the best ones. This is just the tip of the iceberg, boys. Are you somebody that likes playing off meta decks? Maybe a special homebrew creation that you came up all on your own. Well, great news for you, this wasn't playable in United and Stormwind. Arguably the biggest symptom of having the quest lines in the game was the rock, paper, scissors metagame that was born from it. If you weren't faster than a quest line, you had to be, otherwise the game was over, which meant decks were created to be faster than the quest lines, which made this arguably the fastest metagame that Hearthstone has ever seen. If you're someone who liked to play any slower deck or any deck whatsoever that just wasn't outright trying to kill your opponent as fast as possible, it was impossible. There was no room for any slower, fun archetype. And as the meta continued to develop in United and Stormwind, which made it even more impossible to play anything outside of these questline decks or things that killed those questline decks, which again segmented a huge portion of what makes Hearthstone fun for a lot of people. Me personally, I like playing really wacky off meta decks that somehow can get me legend. And if there's no room for that creativity and the only choices are to kill or be killed, I'm probably not going to be having a great time in Hearthstone. And most people felt the exact same way. The number of solitaire games being played went up substantially, and that's not because solitaire was actually being played. It's because Hearthstone became solitaire. And I think the best example of that is the Warlock questline. The whole questline for Warlock was damaging yourself to the end goal that your opponent would take the damage for you once the quest was completed. And you would think taking that much damage would put you in a very vulnerable spot, No, you could get that done pretty quickly. In fact, Warlock had an insane amount of mana cheating in this expansion as well. So imagine Warlock having the ability to not even worry about fatigue, draw through their entire deck, and most importantly, kill you in the process without you being able to stop it whatsoever. I can maybe get over the fact that my opponent is virtually just trying to get to their win condition as fast as possible to kill me. When there's no interactivity because I don't need to interact with my opponent whatsoever, what is the point of playing Hearthstone? I'm here to play a multiplayer game against a very kind stranger who also enjoys card games, not some rando that wants to murder me. And I haven't even mentioned Garrote Rogue yet, which wasn't even a quest line. And that was also really good because it could just kill you without interacting with your opponent. So if you're wondering why people were so upset with this expansion, it's not just because the win conditions were consistent. There was no interaction between me and my opponent. And one of the reasons for that was the lack of counterplay. There wasn't a lot of cards that you could put into your deck to actually stop your opponent from doing what they wanted to do to you. Very few instances, maybe you could slow them down, but for the most part, you're slowing down your own win condition, which meant you're gonna lose that game in the long run. And because the cards in Stormwind were so powerful, a lot of the other expansions in the standard format could not compete with this. If you look at the power discrepancy between an expansion like Darkmoon Faire versus United and Stormwind, it's an absolute joke. You might remember these two cards, Gen and Baku. Both of these cards were introduced in the Witchwood and drastically changed the metagame, but more importantly, made the game feel almost the exact same way every single time. One of the main reasons for this was because they were so powerful against the rest of the field that if you weren't running one of them, you had to have a really good reason not to, which made a lot of games feel very similar, very consistent, and there wasn't that randomness that Hearthstone is very much known for. People always make fun of randomness when it comes to Hearthstone and act like it's not a skill-based game because of it, and sometimes I do agree with those people, but for the most part, the reason why randomness is so important in a game like Hearthstone is to get rid of that consistency. Games that lead to these really wacky scenarios is what makes Hearthstone so enjoyable, just like board-centric gameplay. If everything is that consistent, the game ends up being so unfun and people do not want to play it, which is one of the reasons why Gen and Baku had to be rotated early. And that has never happened before. But the team at Blizzard probably understood that having your game played the same way every single time isn't going to be enjoyable for the average player in the long run. And if you want people to continue playing your game, you're gonna need that variability, which is another reason why Stormwind doesn't make any sense. I could go on forever about this expansion, but Stormwind is my least favorite expansion. I hated this expansion because the improper balance of quest lines, a very interesting metagame that I can't believe was actually formed in Hearthstone, the lack of interactivity in a multiplayer game, and arguably, if it wasn't for Voyage in the Sunken City, which was one of the best expansions that they have released, to come and save this game from drowning. It's ironic because Voyage into the Sunken City is literally an underwater city. I don't know where Hearthstone would have been.